All right. Welcome back to the Howard Experience Show, Mindhead series. Earth Catastrophe Cycle by the Suspicious Observer, Ben Davidson. Streaming again live from Guam, USA. Ladies and gentlemen. Parts 3 to 5 will be streaming live today. Starting off with, as you have seen already in the main opening picture frame, $21 trillion. It's a lot of fucking money, man. Again, the series is all about scientific and legendary stories of the past come together and meet. Some say at a crossroad, others say inevitability because of the evidence shown to us around the world. From the north to the south, to the east to west. It's all over, ladies and gentlemen. You just gotta open your eyes. And this series from Suspicious Observer, Ben Davidson, focuses on the evidence that's right before your eyes. So, as we said last week in the beginning of this series of the Mindhead, hopefully you'll take this information and do the best is what you can with it. Make your own mind up, make your own decisions, and watch and prepare. He had released just earlier today the newest episode, which is up to 19 right now. So if you're following the series and you kind of want to jump ahead, I would definitely implore you to take a look at it today. More on the side of what to do, how to prepare in series 19. And we're playing catch up right now, and we'll do this once a week. And like I just said, today's episode 3, 4, 5. A lot of great information. So without further ado, again, get a drink, get something to eat, share with your family and friends, and again, thank you for watching. Hopefully this information will be of some type of net worth too. Here we go.
This is part 3 on Earth's catastrophe cycle, taking a look at the present time and asking just one simple question. By now many of you have heard about the 21 trillion that is untraceable in the US government. The culprits are the Department of Defense and HUD, housing. The question, of course, is where did the money come from and where did it go? In this case, did some of it go to preparation for Earth's catastrophe? It's been 1 year since we learned the 21 trillion went unaccounted for, and here is what we know now. It turns out that to call the $21 trillion missing isn't really accurate. It's not a one-way deal. There's 21 trillion in untraceable accounting events, both in and out. So some of the mystery involved money that came in, which admittedly sounds better than mysteriously going out, but still, where did it come from? And since they aren't running at a surplus, at the very best, we have 10.5 trillion mysteriously coming into the situation and 10.5 trillion going out. Now, in the last year, the Pentagon underwent an audit and failed, and I read about everything there is on this since then, and it's clear that the scales are probably significantly tipped towards the money going out, although I was admittedly more puzzled by the money coming in from out of nowhere, hundreds of billions coming out of thin air. There's absolutely no accounting for those monies. Some is undoubtedly depreciation and pension and closed assets, things like that. But those numbers are almost certainly below 1 trillion. And furthermore, why is HUD involved? That's a lot of housing. Where is it being built? The director of our plasma lab, Billy Elverton, said it very poignantly. That money wasn't spent on the surface of Earth. We'd see it. There is, of course, one exception, if it's in Antarctica, the place that would no longer be an uninhabitable frozen hell. But in truth, that much money does indeed lend one to think about above and below, outer space and deep Earth. Because the money is not only not evident in the infrastructure we see around the planet, but also it's not in the economy, as was discussed on the Suspect Sky roundtable. Inflation would be through the roof, and so the money did not enter the economy as we know it. This leaves space, Antarctica, and underground, and almost entirely outside the normal economy. And then there is the problem of HUD's involvement. One would love to be optimistic and speculate that the housing is underground and for everyone they're going to try to save if such a catastrophe occurs. One hopes it wouldn't be something like an off-world sanctuary for the rich. If it is, I'm hoping the sun gives them all she's got. Just thinking about Douglas Boat and the recurring micronova possibility, Mars and the moon aren't going to cut it if you're not 1,000% sure it's not the sun. Unless you are sure it's not the sun, secret space colony would have to be just past Jupiter or Saturn. We mentioned in episode 1, Pikes Peak, mentioned as a safe zone by the classified Chan work, is basically connected to Cheyenne Mountain next door. The roads into the mountain, like NORAD Road, are not really all that a secret. It is a known megabase existing inside the mountain. But then there are the stories of what's beneath Denver Airport, just up the road from Colorado Springs, and ever since I've lived in New Mexico, I've heard of stories of secret places around this state, many of which also underground. But these are things that many people know about, and whether or not you know it, we're consistently 10, 20, maybe 30 years behind the technological state in secret. Who knows what they have done underground? We don't even know what we don't know. That sentiment in hand, the same could be said for Earth's catastrophe cycle itself. While the evidence for a cycle of disaster exists, how long the cycle is exactly, how much longer do we have? In what form will the disaster come and just how bad will it be? These are open questions. If you remember episode 1, that seemed pretty extreme, almost unsurvivable, and we are all here today because someone survived it last time. As an example of why the classified work might be a bit extreme, yes, the equator rotates at 1,000 miles an hour, which is the stated speed that the wind would rip across the planet from that first classified work. But remember, that's only the equator, and that would require a full, immediate stop to be realized at that speed in the catastrophe, and the same goes for the oceans, getting a little bit less scary the further away you get from the equator. Now I'll leave you with this in anticipation of the next episode on possibly the worst case scenario. This cataclysm, if cyclical, would have to be the sort that hits a very narrow sweet spot between total world annihilation and a globally relevant catastrophe that does not kill everyone and leaves some behind to tell the stories. That is a narrow sweet spot indeed. Until next time, eyes open, no fear. Be safe, everyone. Sister of the nova, one that can affect the entire world, but not completely destroy it. In the first time in just the last 10 days, can the sun really micronova? Perhaps your question was merely, what is a micronova? It's not a supernova, it's not even really a nova, as it is like the little sister of the nova, one that can affect the entire world, but not completely destroy it. In this way, it offers the one thing that all impactor hypotheses cannot, a way for the cycle to happen again and again and again. And it turns out that the sun satisfies the impactor hypothesis as well, and potentially been a bit more beneath our noses than we realized. Now let's begin with the what. What would this type of event be? Well, variable stars are already well known, mostly changing in photon emission and luminosity, but with noticeable effects often seen rippling out in succession. But there are also the repeating particle blasters, the 10 known recurrent nova of the Milky Way. These are exactly what they sound like. Astronomers have witnessed multiple nova from the same star. Not supernova, which destroy what was there, but a smaller nova, still tremendously powerful, such that an Earth around it would have been obliterated. But alas, in that sweet spot where the star can boom again and again, and in some cases again and again and again. Now, in all of these cases, it is thought that a sun-like star has a close orbiting binary, much smaller than it, which feeds material down, accumulating in the atmosphere of it and triggering an explosive shell release. It is notable that while some or all may be binaries, none of the purported binary stars have ever been imaged at those regions, and in fact, solitary stars will encounter dust and gas and asteroids and comets and accumulate the same material over time. The single most important thing to know right now is there is almost no serious astronomer alive who would claim this list is complete. They fully expect to see some of the nova they have cataloged in the last century show up once again and make this list, and way more importantly, they know there are almost certainly those with extremely long cycle times that we have not even seen go boom once in the time of astronomical science, which really only goes back about 100 years for these types of events, and which could completely miss a cycle of hundreds or thousands of years, even if it's right in our backyard. This evidence of seemingly impossible and unimaginable scenarios on our star is complex but unnerving in how convincing it can be. There is no shortcut here, so let's begin with our 2014 interview with Robert Schoch, the famous Yale-trained geologist and a professor at Boston for 30 years, who takes us from Egypt to a solar disaster unlike anything we've ever seen. We are here with Robert Schoch.
The traditional Egyptologists consider the Great Sphinx 2500 BC, to date from 2500 BC approximately, and weathering on the body of the Sphinx in particular did not match the 2500 BC date. What I mean by that is that the body of the Sphinx is carved down into the bedrock. Only the head stands above the general level of the plateau. And I'm saying now the head is recarved, so it's not the original head on the Great Sphinx. The body is what you have to look at, and the walls of what are known as the Sphinx enclosure, these are heavily weathered by rain. You can see that in the way the layers have sort of what I call rolling or undulating profile. They have deep vertical fissures. So this suggested to me almost immediately on my first trip that there was something amiss here, that there was something earlier than the Great Sphinx as we see it now with a human head and a lion body, and that in fact, based on the level of weathering, based on the climatic regime, had to go back at least a few thousand years. The Egyptologists in particular, they were livid. They were absolutely livid. The archaeologists were livid. They told me that this was absolutely impossible. They said that civilization didn't go back that far. Civilization only went back about 5, maybe 6,000 years at the most. People were hunter-gatherers. They couldn't build stone sculptures. They couldn't build monumental structures, that I must be crazy, that I was a pseudoscientist. I mean, they were really calling me nasty names. I'm now happy pushing the origins of the Sphinx back to even 10,000 or so BC, the very end of the last ice age. And this ties in also with what I believe was happening at the end of the last ice age, which included torrential rains, very different climate than we have now. And I believe that the evidence we have is indicating that we had civilization, what I call high civilization, back at the end of the last ice age, all of which was devastated by major solar outbursts, what I call earlier cycle of civilization. The best dating on this is about 9700 BC. At that point, it suddenly gets incredibly warm, very, very warm, and based on ice cores in particular from Greenland, also looking at various sediment cores and other data, including even some lunar data that was collected, we have a very sudden warming snap just about 9700 BC at the best calibration. And this happened so quickly that Based on ice cores, it was within 1 to 3 years. The thing is, we can't resolve it any better than that. It could have literally been within a couple of weeks or even overnight, which is essentially off the scale, if you would. And when you look at isotope data for solar activity and various proxies for solar activity that you find, again, sediment cores and ice cores, I believe what we had at 9700 BC is an incredible solar outburst, the Carrington event by orders of magnitude greater. This is based on isotope evidence from Greenland ice cores. It shows that the sun was very active, very unstable at that time, underwent these major solar outbursts, and this would have the effect of warming the climate dramatically, virtually overnight, virtually instantaneously. This is something that was predicted by Thomas Gold, or hypothesized by Thomas Gold, as early as the 1960s. He was an award-winning astronomer at Cornell University. When people say, oh, you've gone off the deep end when you're talking about something like that happening. But he, as other astrophysicists have pointed out, our sun is a star. It's not the same all the time, geologically, if I could put it that way. But I wanted to mention, too, that there's other evidence for this. When you start looking at the archaeological record, I believe that a lot of things fall into place when you start thinking in terms of a major solar outburst bringing down these early civilizations, these what I'll call late Ice Age civilizations. I do want to mention, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with Anthony Perrott and his work, Dr. Perrott and his the plasma physicist. And he has done, of course, a lot of work looking at petroglyphs, in particular ancient petroglyphs, and has independent from my work, hypothesized or suggested that these ancient petroglyphs are drawings, effectively, of plasma configurations in the sky during a major solar outburst in antiquity, as he calls it, deep antiquity. I believe this corresponds with the solar outburst I'm talking
familiar?
about. Vitrification is something that has been found in the archaeological record, which is very mysterious in the sense of how do you explain it. What it is surface melting and recongealing, I'll call it that way, refreezing of rock surfaces. This is known throughout parts of Europe and getting into Turkey and Syria. This gets back to something that Thomas Gould was talking about and hypothesized in the 60s, that during a major solar outburst, you would have in certain areas, sort of like a tornado, not everywhere, but certain areas, huge, we can think of as huge thunderbolts or lightning bolts actually hitting the surface. And I believe we found it. You also find that in parts of the Sahara, for instance. Most people probably are familiar with one thing from Plato, if they know anything about Plato, and that is the story of Atlantis. He is very clear about the chronology. And when you turn that into our modern chronology, he basically dates the fall of Atlantis. He dates it to about 9600 BC, which to me is more, it's probably beyond coincidental that this, in fact, is the modern dating of the end of the last ice age.
This is an animation inside one of those variable stars I mentioned. Essentially, the concept of variable stellar activity is not a new one. Just think about the sunspot cycle. But here we require the extending of the scales to the extremes, and luckily just requiring so at the extremes of a long cycle. Let's begin this examination with the wildest claim made so far today, that a solar micronova could actually act like the impactor scenario and give us all that evidence like a comet or asteroid impact would. We heard a little bit of this from Robert Schoch, and we'll hit this once now and again in the remaining evidence. But first, it is thought that nearly the whole sun's shell is blasted outward, ending up making a solar system that looks like this. But forget the model, because we now have the best image recurring nova, and it's what they think they would see if they could see them all this well. This rapidly cycling nova has produced a debris field of densely compacted blobs spread over an area 1 light year across. These are the remnants of not only 6 such recurring nova at this star, the ones we've seen, but all of the ones that came before. NASA describes it as a shotgun blast debris. They expect there to be pieces the size of megaplanets to the size of dust, which is why the fully realized debris field looks like this. According to the evidence, any planets in orbit would have been blasted like a shotgun of heavy material, the heavier elements too, like carbon, iron, lithium, and more. Let's go next to the fact that cycles appear to be the name of the game. The cyclical nature presents problems for one-time events like an impactor. Yes, we could be entering a stream of impactors every 12,000 years, but is that more likely to produce that narrow sweet spot of global disaster but not total annihilation? Or does a solar clock cycle make more sense for something that needs to be repeatable? I want to look at Douglas Volk right now because not only does he prefer the cycle like many other great researchers in the field, but also because he, like shock, and like many of our ancestors, like the sun as the culprit. And nobody has ever put that version of this story together like he has. His name should be with Velikovsky, Hapgood, and others, if not above them. His books are ungodly more cited than the selectivity I will agree was needed for his free YouTube videos, but you don't need the hundreds of citations in those books to get the picture. He communicates it well. The cycle of 12,000 years is evident at least 6 times in the organic material carbon dating. 12,000, 24,000, 36,000, 48,000, 60,000, and 72,000 years ago, which implicates slow geological crawl, punctuated by horrific extinction every 12,000 years. But these cycles can also be found in non-glacial evidence in the rock strata and in the volcanic outflows as well. He describes what many others have described, the surprise findings of glacial carvings on now equatorial lands from just the last few cycles. And we know the whole Earth didn't get that cold, so those areas weren't at the equator when it happened. Now, while he gives you tons of citations, and I know there are some of you who geek out on that, I want to go another direction with this specific line of evidence. I can tell you as the grandson of 2 veterans of foreign wars that the stories passed down in that realm are not like Santa or bedtime stories. You know they are real because Grandma and Mom are often scolding Grandpa, and Grandpa is responding that they need to hear this or they need to know how it really was, and you can see it in their faces, even as a child. This, I'm sure, was the case with young Ken White, as his father, Major Maynard E. White, commander of Project Nanook, told him stories of the first men to battle the North Pole by air. The stories are the basis for his book, World in Peril. After about 100 pages of everything there is to know about just how much it stinks to be stuck up in the Arctic flying airplanes and how scary the Soviet threat was at the time, not to mention negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you get an almost out-of-place 4 chapters sandwiched in the middle of the book that have almost nothing to do with what comes before or after, except it was Major White's squadron that did it, and which really test your belief in the stories passed down from soldier to child. At least that would be the case if not for all the corroborating evidence. The following parts that are not from known science works are direct communications from Major White to his son, Ken, mostly about the secret meetings at the Pentagon. It is up to us to decide for ourselves if we believe the son's testimony. After laying out how they were presented the various lines of evidence for catastrophe that punctuates the slow crawl of geology, from preserved trees at high latitude that must have lived their lives at the equator, the same can be found in Antarctica, along with a coal seam that must have come from an enormous forest continent, and of course the dead animals, the boneyards, and then the conclusions found at the site, and then after consideration at the Pentagon. They initially believed they had actually found evidence of 9 cycles of catastrophe. One important note was the recognition of what may have happened to science since the late 1940s, which is the confusion caused by the movement and contamination of the rocks used to date and navigate the ancient world from millennia in the future. Interesting to see that what proponents of catastrophe said had happened was expressly mentioned as a possibility for scientists at the Pentagon. More on that in a moment. The Major quickly learned that this was not strictly a military operation, The Rand Corporation's involvement became predominant almost immediately at the Pentagon, and they performed thousands of experiments with the same thing happening every time. The North Pole would slowly meander around the Arctic Circle and then begin to trace towards the pole, speeding up, faster, and then catch a hairpin turn around the geographic pole and come back down. This is crucial because they say the mantle and core have never ever shifted their rotational axis. It is just the thin crust that can be torqued. And this is due to the magnetization of the crust, which is full of metal, crystal, and polar molecules known as water, which will seek to take that bent horseshoe-like magnet and straighten it out through a crustal displacement. Their analysis revealed 4 of the 9 layers to be doubles, and the Pentagon confidently nailed down 5 cycles of catastrophe. They fell 12,000 years apart. Now, adding to the possible confusion that geologists faced, we mentioned it a few minutes ago, the discussions at the Pentagon on whether to tell the public really illuminate how the process eventually became a highly controlled, limited hangout aimed at testing the waters of the public. As we saw in Part 1, this is really how they decided on secrecy and potentially drove the public version of the story from Hapgood in a direction that could be easily debunked. Don't forget, he came from the CIA first. Now, while they pegged the crust displacement to a magnetic pole flip in the late 40s, they never took it any further, and it would be a decade until the sun scared them in the late 50s, and NASA was created 3 months later. This is where Vogt comes in, and the others today and in the past who have pointed to the sun. Major White did not have that tool in the toolbox, neither did the Pentagon or the stories they had to tell his son. There are 2 lines of evidence here that are critical: the mystery of the sun and the evidence of its recurring micronova. Why does the sun have an 11-year cycle of sunspot and solar flare activity, and an 88-year Gleesberg cycle? Well, their best guesses have produced what's known as the dynamo model, but advanced viewers of this channel know that even parts of this are a somehow the sun does it explanation. In truth, it is fairly difficult to understand how a thermonuclear engine at the core results in those cycles, especially when the greater grand cycle of activity projects even longer timelines. Our work on the sun and earthquakes indicates their magnetic fields can affect terrestrial seismicity, and that is difficult to reconcile with this nuclear engine driving it all. And perhaps the most interesting is the near-perfect sphere shape, the most perfect sphere in the known cosmos, which seems impossible due to the same forces that bulge out every other known sphere in the cosmos. These things implicate that the sun might be some sort of clock, that it has a deep electromagnetic connection to the planet Earth, and that it is not following the rules of science we would traditionally prescribe to it. If the sun is on a 12,000-year micronova cycle, there would be no modern observations. But our ancestors would have had to do something crazy, like claim the sun was responsible for disaster. Wink. Vogt is the only person I have ever heard discuss the dark periods and light travel time to Earth in the stellar records, and the only one I've ever heard look at naturally produced glass beads on the moon with fission tracks and recognize that the scientists were saying something without saying it publicly in the journals. It was this revelation that these came from the micronova. They are the exploded shell, combined with the shotgun blast we see at other recurring micronova systems, leads one to believe that at one time, or maybe many times in the cycle, including at the end of the Younger Dryas, a larger chunk of the blasted micronova shell hit the Earth as an impactor. It would not even have to do so, since its energetic state would produce arc discharges that can only create craters with high iron content at the base due to the magnetic aspect of the event. If it hits, if it discharges, the impactor theory is satisfied. These recreations of craters and burn scars are from the Yelverton Plasma Laboratory. In the next episode, we'll have Douglas Vogt here to describe the evidence and finer detail of the solar micronova scenario, including why he thinks Earth has less than 3 decades left until the next one. Eyes open, no fear. Be safe, everyone. Once it was an impossible scenario outside the scope of our imagination. The great solar flash, a darkened sun, ancient stories relived, fire from the sky. All now up for reconsideration with a scientific state of mind, to prove that the evidence mounting at recurring nova in the cosmos is complementary to the stories of our ancestors and the events that walk through time to have now molded modern belief and understanding of the universe. What would the solar micronova look like if you were on the ISS staring out at the sun? The imagination wanders to some interesting places. Does the outer shell to be ejected crust up, cool, and darken before breaking out into space? Do we get any warning at all from the sun? Or does a micronova shell release begin with a flash and then fill our view with the ejection? The best evidence suggests that we could have 15 to 20 hours between the energetic flash of X-rays, extreme ultraviolet, and gamma rays, and then the arrival of the main particle burst cloud. After this, it would be a bit of luck. What hits us? What flies just past as we watch in amazement? How long before the dust clears enough for the sun to shine again, and for those who remain to feel that their worry is waning and that they can enjoy the awe of watching the material race away from them at night? What if the cloud expands so slowly that we have to watch not only in the direction of the sun, but ahead in our orbit around it at 67,000 miles an hour? If a micronova were to happen, the shock wave would be widely diverse elementally. Its temperature range and photon emission would be broad. Iron, carbon, iridium, tungsten, gold, silver, and diamonds would be amidst the hydrogen and helium. Transuranic elements pollute the ejection of dusty turbulent plasma, as well as glass beads and enormous chunks of material. In this video, we will hear from Douglas Vogt. We will explore how his ideas offer new light on Velikovsky, Carlson, Hancock, and Hapgood, and we will revisit a concept that twists the imagination.
There's two events happening here. When the sun novas, it's the heat from that nova and also cosmic rays we get within 8 minutes of when the sun novas. Then, now remember, for another 17 to 18 hours, that dust shell is still on the way. It hasn't hit until, I estimate, 17 to 18 hours after the nova. So the first thing happens is the surface is going to get melted and glazed. Ironically, the Torah winds up saying the moon turned red. Well, yeah, it turned red. It just got baked and melted. That's the glazing that Thomas Gold and others had noticed all around the place. Then the dust shell hit 17, 18 hours later. Several assumptions. One, you can't assume that this dust shell is homogeneous because the evidence we've seen both on the Earth and on the moon, they have the different samples they brought back from Apollo 11, 16, 17, a few others. They had different chemical compositions. It was the same stuff they found in the South Pole and other places on the Earth. So it's when they say it impacts like another meteor. Remember, these scientists can't think in terms of a sun noving. What I'm trying to tell everybody, this is not an easy process that happens. It's a complicated one. It's not just the sun. It's not just that the Earth stops its rotation and the oceans keep going. It's also the crust of the Earth, just like the oceans, are going to start banging up against each other. So after the moon gets glazed by and melted by the sun's nova, 17 hours later, the dust shell comes and puts a fresh new load of dust on top of it. Remember, the moon appeared red. It was melting. Some of those rocks may have a lot of iron in it or basalt, and they may have still been so hot that when the glass beads landed on it, they just melted.
So it appears that one of their main ways that they date and they track these things is through their fission tracking. But it is quite clear from the literature and from the current state of the science that these things are all basically presuming uranium and nothing but uranium in terms of the decaying elements. And yet we've had a couple of papers show...
On the Earth, that would be true. On the moon, that's not true.
Yeah, because we have a couple of those papers. I think the most interesting one was the one called Super Heavy Elements from Extraterrestrial Sources, where they showed that elements higher than number 110 were present in almost all of the samples of the moon and the meteorite when they cooled.
Right?
Yeah.
I have that art. Sure, I know what they are.
Absolutely. So,
way too much time reading journal articles.
Well, so is it correct to assume that if there were all of those much heavier elements, that their dating of these things is going to be off if they're just assuming it's all uranium?
Right.
Okay.
It's beyond that. It's beyond stupid. They have two problems.
This
said,
fucking guy is awesome.
if you have a large element compared to a small element, a small atom, it's going to make a different size hole and also go deeper. We see that in samples here on the Earth. You can't wind up assuming that I have samples of bone fragment, at least I cited, not personally. There were different holes, and this stuff was on the surface, and there was no uranium deposits there in Mongolia. I mean, they're grasping for straws because they don't know where else or how else to explain it. Here they get a sample, matter in their hand, and they got a bunch of holes in it. A lot of the samples they're getting from Antarctica and other places, they don't know to try to get the fission tracks. What for fission tracks? The stuff that came back from the moon in 69 and through the 70s, they were smart enough to look for fission tracks, and they found plenty of them. In fact, almost all the Gillespie that I know of had fission tracks in it, and about 5 or 6 different radioactive elements. Aluminum 26, beryllium-10, a bunch of them, that could only have been formed from a stellar nova. You know, you have to have relativistic temperatures. Got it?
Right.
You don't have that from a volcano. You don't have that from an impact crater. For someone to say it was an impact crater, who's no expert in that field, you should ask them immediately, what was the title of your PhD thesis? That's the point I'm trying to make to everybody. We have all been brainwashed and kept from the truth because some bureaucrats in the 60s, 58, 59, 60, when they landed on the moon and they got the samples back in 69, and they were scared. It was very obvious they were scared. You could tell by the journal articles of the scientists doing some of the research. They stay so far away from anything that implied that the sun nova. Here I want to try to fix the lies that they were trying to tell us or teach us so we wouldn't come to the truth. And tell people really what they should be fearing. Remember, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Otherwise, nobody's going to make it. This thing is that bad. Remember, the anthropologist said, only 30 fertile females made it. Supposedly that's what we're related to. Even if they were off by a factor of 10 or 100, I got news here. That's extinction level. This particular subject crosses all religions, ethnic backgrounds, country, everything. If you're a human being on the planet and you're not a Malthusian, then you have usually an idea you want somebody to survive this thing. Got the picture? What they didn't know is they didn't know that the Earth's rotation was dependent on the Earth's magnetic field. That didn't show up until October 1968. I'm looking at the thing that I had in 4C. The RAND Corporation and the Air Force did. But if you go through they call it geomagnetic eccentric dipole and changes in the Earth's rotation rate. They may not have clicked. That's kind of abstract for a guy who's in the military and not trained to think maybe a little differently like the Earth. But it's there. That's what they're saying. Now, it's real possible that, somebody in the CIA told them, that's really what it is. Maybe this, or maybe it's so horrible we better not think about it and we'll look the other way.
We chatted a little bit about this before. What do you say? Can you make it to Observing the Frontier 2019 and help sort of make it an even more exciting event than it's already going to be?
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Hope it's not too cold there.
The Sunday panel will be on Earth's catastrophe cycle and will be Mr. Vogt, Dr. August Dunning, and myself, the NOVA panel. Now let's walk down the comet and asteroid impactor rabbit hole for a minute. This would be like Graham Hancock and others you've heard about. Well, if the sun has a micronova, the cloud is likely to have larger chunks of the shell. The only close images of recurring nova demonstrate that very plainly. And the nova shell is as likely, if not more, to have the spectrum of elements. Remember, it was discovered in the 90s that just the ambient solar wind contains the entire continuum of the periodic table. And we in fact know that the transuranic elements, those heavier than uranium, would be present as well. The entire recipe for impactor hypothesis is present with a micronova, and I submit that Carlson and Hancock should consider this an alternative successful solution to their work rather than a competing concept. This should hold especially true given that it satisfies the cycle pattern with the impactor theory. If it is not the Earth but the Sun that enters a dense stream every 12,000 years, then the extra material is there to be ejected. The mechanism for disruption exists. It will have the chemical signature of those solar impactors through and throughout the micronova, and it would satisfy the ancient stories of a comet or comets being involved as well as the Sun. But it should be noted that a micronova shell could look a lot like a comet if the piece is big enough. Now, moving on to the planets and chaos, it must be noted that Vogt does advocate for planetary orbit disruption during the event, and we know slight perturbations can lead to significant orbital instabilities, not to mention the planet-sized chunks that could be flying by as well. It's very easy to understand where those ancient stories came from. It might make sense that the stories told most by Velikovsky and Talbot earn points from this concept, especially in the latter portions of Major Instability. The similarities between Vogt's cosmic theater and that of Major White, Dr. Hapgood, and the fictitious Chan Thomas of the now declassified book by the CIA are surprisingly widespread from a terrestrial perspective. By the way, a couple libraries are known to have the 284-page original Chan book, but you can only get the 57-page sanitized version from the CIA. In Vogt's version of the story, the tilt does not occur, but the rotation changes, which gives us the same tsunamis and wind and earthquakes and volcanoes. I want to end with an interesting concept for the internal solar clock idea, which runs counter to the mechanism needing extra material from comets or nearby planets. Since the internal structure of supernova models and variable stars have some interesting things indeed, shells upon shells appear in the models of both the more variable stars and the more energetic nova. In this animation, we have something between sacred geometry and mechanical magic preceding the slosh action of the nova. I want you to recall that the 11 and 88-year sunspot cycles have no concrete explanation from the science community. The sun just somehow does it, and nothing about a nuclear engine should perform that way. Whether you want to look at the lack of a bulge in the near-perfect sphere, or the evidence of the stars, including our sun, being chronometers of the universe, we know there is much we don't know. We do know that recurring nova are real in the cosmos, and many more are expected to join the list over the coming centuries to millennia. The sun, the earth, the history of our species, and our fate in the future have many questions surrounding them. Still to come in this series is a deeper dive into the evidence of cycles and micronova, more from our interview with Mr. Vogt, along with ways we can track these effects and watch for the big one. While we may be left with nothing afterwards, there is no doubt that the sun, the magnetic poles, and the low velocity zone of Earth can be monitored easily in the meantime. We'll examine what the signs might be and the critical question of severity of the event and cascading effects throughout the Earth. Eyes open, no fear. Be safe, everyone.
Apollo is the second sun god, Greek sun god. First one was Helios, and Helios was superseded by Apollo. So here they're going to the moon with Apollo, the sun god, to collect the evidence that the sun left on the moon roughly 12,000 years ago. You know, they're telling us in plain sight why they created NASA and why they're going back there. It's all about the sun. That should be the most obvious thing to everybody to understand. They hide it in plain sight. Regarding the CIA, I feel sorry for some of the agents of today and their leadership. These decisions were made back in the late 50s, and certainly when the stuff came back from the moon, they knew what they had to do. And everybody who's there now, they had no part in it. All they did was they had to follow orders. But it's a mistake. If they try to get decent advice from a geophysicist or a physicist, an astrophysicist, or astronomer on this event, or a solar physicist, I have news for you. They're going to get bad advice because they brainwashed 60 years worth of scientists. What's that? 3 generations of scientists they've brainwashed to think the way they want. How are they going to get an honest answer out of them?
Yeah.
It's not their fault. This is only what they were fed in the textbooks and what they were taught from the school, and believe me, this is what they had to regurgitate to get their PhD. If they went outside the box
And there you have it, folks. Parts 3 to 5. Suspicious Observer. Ben Davidson breaks it down. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Again, you can watch the other series if you want to, pull ahead. The series is up to 19 right now. You can follow Suspicious Observer, YouTube, Facebook, even has a Twitter account. There's definitely a lot of information that is worth sharing, And you got nothing to lose. You got nothing to lose but everything to gain, such as knowledge. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Mindhead series. It's the Howard Experience Show. Peace out, ladies and gentlemen. Be safe.